There we go. And then I'm going to hand over to Janet.
Oh, hi everybody. First of all, I just want to excuse myself because I've got a bit of a chest infection and a sore throat. So if you can't hear me, just shout up. And if I disappear in a fit of coughing, just, ignore that. But I'm going to just talk for a little bit about the review. But, as there's just so few of us, if you've got a question, don't try and keep it to the end, because I don't know about you, but I always forget what questions I've got if I don't ask them straight away. Please feel free to interrupt. It'll give me a chance to have a cough or have a drink. So, just ask me anything. So I'm Janet Kay. I come from Sheffield. I'm a kinship carer. I've been for the last 7.5 years. I've got a 9-year-old grandson who came to me when he was 1. And he lives with myself and my husband. He's my oldest daughter's child. Recently been diagnosed with ADHD, so he's a lively one, but fortunately not so far got the behavioural problems. I'm also a member of the Kinship Advisory Board and have been for, I'm going to say this circumspectly because I can't actually remember, but Jackie probably knows the answer to this, but ever since it was invented, which was several years ago, so that's as best as I can tell you. And as well as being on the Kinship Advisory Group, I'm also a member of the Independent Review of Children's Social Care on the Experts by Experience Board. And that is basically a group of 16 of us who were chosen from 1,100 people who applied. So you felt like you won a prize when you got on. We were chosen to represent people who actually had experience of care. And at this point, I ought to mention, I think I got chosen because they get 2 for 1 with me. I'm a kinship carer, but also I'm an adopter as well. So I sort of, covered a couple of slots. So I've been on that since March, and I'll tell you more about that later. And like many things that we get into, including becoming kinship carers, I really didn't know what I was letting myself in for, but I will mention that later. I'm not using any slides because the session's recorded, and also because I've gone off slides on Zoom. I just think it's overkill myself. So I thought this would be a bit more relaxed. So what is the Independent Review of Children's Social Care? Well, it's in England, so it doesn't apply to any of the other UK countries. But it basically is the most significant and far-reaching review of children's social care in the past 30 years. For those of you old enough to remember, the last major review of children's social care was produced the 1989 Children Act, which was a very long time ago. And I think the important thing to remember about this is that it really is a once in a generation opportunity to actually change children's social care to something that works for us now. And I think that Josh McAllister, the chair of the review board, described our current care system as a 30-year-old tower of Jenga held together by sellotape. And what he argued was it was both shaky and rigid in the terms that it was not flexible enough to meet the needs of children now, but also shaky in terms of what it could provide. So, what I'm saying really is this review is long overdue. We need this review to actually improve our children's social care system, which has not been meeting the needs of children and families for a long time. And we've tinkered. There's been reviews that have tinkered. There's been reviews that have ended up on a dusty shelf. And there has been, sort of attempts to improve and change. But overall, the structure has remained the same for a very long time. So this one of the reasons why it's important to engage with this review is we might not get the chance again, not not for a very long time. So, and if we mess it up now, if we don't contribute, if we don't show, some passion for change at the moment, we won't get it. And I think that's, my main message, grab this chance, because it's really not going to come our way very soon again. Now, the main objectives of the review are to make sure that all children who live outside their families have love, safety and stability. And I think one of the things that we, sort of really think about a lot on the review is, the idea, all children's social care system want safety and stability for children. But the one thing I think that as children have been let down in the current system mainly is around issues of love, because we have so many children living in sort of impermanent situations, children who leave care into a world where they've got nobody to love and support them, children going into flats at 17 and 18 with only one paid worker who comes maybe once a month to see them, children who are actually not able to look after themselves, having to do so. And then we have the worst excesses where children in their teens are placed in board and lodgings, tents, caravans, all sorts of places that they've ended up. So we've failed on the love and relationships bit for children very significantly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that's something we need to focus on enormously at the moment in the review. So the background to the review is that in 2019, the government manifesto stated it was going to review children's social care, and the independent review was announced in January this year and actually sort of launched on the 1st of March. Josh McAllister is the chair, and his background is in teaching, but he's also set up social work training, which is quite different in many ways to the social work training we find in other establishments. I won't go into that too much, but it's around some values around how we actually support people who need sort of better relationships with social workers and other people who work in the children's social care system. So all of this is part of the government's what they call levelling up agenda, because one of the reasons to improve children's social care is that children's social care affects children mainly who live in poverty, and it affects children disproportionately who come from ethnic minority groups and who come from deprived areas. So part of the levelling up approach is to recognise that children who are subject to children's social care are generally, sort of children who are already suffering deprivations. And there's been some major challenges as well, which have made the current children's social care system really a lot more shaky. There's been huge increases in the number of kids who are looked after, children who are subject to care orders and who are looked after in the sense of being in either foster care or residential care, but not living with their families. 80,000 now, which is an enormous number, and that has rapidly increased in the last few years. The costs are very high. Privatisation of both fostering and residential care have led the costs to absolutely rocket. The costs of private residential care are, off the scale, and often force authorities like in Sheffield into a situation where they are unable to provide preventative services at a level that will stop children coming into care because they spend so much on children who are in care. And that vicious cycle is common in cash-strapped authorities throughout England. And I imagine it's common in actually some that aren't that cash-strapped, but high costs, lots of postcode lotteries in terms of what sort of kind of support and help you get, lots of variations across the country. And simply lack of homes for children. They aren't recruiting enough people to actually take care of the children who are coming into care, hence children ending up in some inappropriate places. So this review has been described as bold and broad. It's not intended to tinker at the edges of the existing system. It's intended to actually change that system radically. And I think that's really important, because if we want radical change, there's, I've sat in meetings with people who said, oh, well, we shouldn't suggest this because they'll never do it. And I was saying to them, suggest it, because if we don't suggest it, how will they know that that's what we want? We shouldn't be pulling punches here. We should be saying exactly what it is that we would like in the future. Now, one of the things the review has done is made it a priority to hear from children and carers. Hence, the Experts by Experience board, which I'm on. Our first task was to link the review board with groups and organisations and people, individuals who were care experienced and had something to say about children's social care. And that was our first job. So the first thing I did was call Lucy Peake, who's say, I'm on the review board, so let's set up a meeting. And Kinship, and I'll come back to this later as well, has been very involved with the review right from the start, which is excellent. So that was our first role. Make sure they get to hear from the people that we want them to hear from. So I don't really do anything around fostering or children in care or care leavers, because my focus is mainly on kinship and adoption, and we've tended to sort of pick our own territory. And though we show an interest in each other's territory and go along to some of the meetings, we promote the bits that we're most familiar with. So that's been very successful. So there was a big, to start the review, there was a big, sort of influx of meetings and workshops and events, so that the review board could start to hear from care experienced people. And by care experienced people, I mean anybody who's been in care, anybody who's been a carer, or anybody who's had anything to do with the children's social care system. So that includes professionals and practitioners as well. The remit is to look at all services, excuse me, from early help onwards, right through to leaving care. And the idea is to improve the outcomes for children who come out of the care system, because one of the true disgraces of this current system, and I'm quite happy to use that word, disgrace, is the outcomes for children. If we think about the tiny proportion of children who are actually in care, yet they constitute a quarter of homeless people, young people, a quarter of the prison population. Then nearly 40% of them are not in education, employment and training, and only 30% of them go into higher education, with the average in the general population being 43%. And for many young people, going through the care system means a lifetime of additional services and need. If you're homeless, your chances of employment are low. Many suffer from mental health and relationship problems, housing problems, and really just survival problems at times. So, being in care can be, a very sort of, the outcomes are very dangerous for, in terms of a positive life. It's also, the review is going to not just look at children's social care direct, it's going to look at the services that also are around, other agencies that contribute to children's care, like police and health and education. So what are the themes for the themes are support for children's needs, So looking at how we can better support children's actual needs within the care system, but starting really with the idea of doing this within families by strengthening families so that care can be avoided. So one of the remits of this is to start to look again at early help, which is very variable across this country, but to look at how we can actually help families stay together and parent well, before we start to get into, sort of looking at children coming into care. And I think one of the big questions of the review is, how do we actually provide early support for while, avoiding families feeling as if they're being investigated all the time. At the moment, because funding tends to go towards things that local authorities have to do, which is investigate child protection issues, then you tend to get early support through the child protection system, which leaves families feeling as if they're being interrogated and investigated rather than actually supported. I think there's also, alongside that is the need for both early help and a very proactive approach to safeguarding. We have to have a point where children aren't safe in their own homes and need to come into care. And there has been talk of actually separating out the services that provide early help and provide safeguarding. Whether that will work, nobody really knows, or whether that'll be the final decision, nobody really knows. It's one of the dilemmas. How do we help families but still safeguard their children when it's necessary? If children have to come into care, then it needs to make it a positive experience, which for many children it isn't. At the moment, children come into care and many of them move placement, and the impact of moving from one carer to another in terms of children's outcome is enormous. There's a huge, any of you who've got children, will know that taking them from one carer to another, the profoundly traumatic effect on the child. They also want to have, a workforce that can deliver this service and for it to be cost effective. At the moment, it isn't cost effective. There's some very high costs. And finally, that it'll be an accountable service, that, there'll be effective oversight. So the review was very fast moving from the start. The first part of it was developing what they called the case for change. And this was simply setting out, having drawn on all these people who are willing to contribute, simply setting out, why children's social care needed to change and in what ways. It was making the argument that, that change was necessary. And that's when, contributions of a loss of care experienced people were very helpful. And that was published in June. And one of the things that came out of that case for change straight away was that kinship care had become a leading element in what was seen as the future of children's social care. The need for change and development of kinship care was at the forefront of the argument about where care for children was going to go next. And I think that was a really important statement that, because I think lots of kinship carers feel like, well, I mean, some of us don't even feel part of the care system. We don't feel as if, that actually affects us. We're so divorced from support or sort of training or anything else that we just don't feel we're connected to that system. So to hear that we are going to be a priority within this children's social care review is really positive. And that I know for a fact that Josh McAllister is absolutely dead set on supporting development of kinship care and providing better support for kinship carers, at which point we all ought to shout hooray, because really there hasn't been consistent support for kinship carers across the country forever, really. So I think we're in there as a group, and I think that's really important to be there right at the start of this. I think the review teams have stated clearly that kinship care was to be prioritised and supported, and both to evolve arrangements that kept children in families. They're very keen, and this goes back to what I was saying early on about the emphasis being on children getting love and attachment, and the proper parenting that they need, is that the review team think for many children that will be provided in extended families effectively. And I think that's partly because the outcomes for children in kinship care are surprisingly good, for saying that we're so poorly resourced. We don't get any of the we don't get many of the resources that children in foster care get, or children in adopted children, and yet still the children come out of kinship care, and they're fine. A lot of them are very fine, and we do well with it. I was reading the latest kinship care survey that Kinship did, and it was really heartening to see that where there's huge concerns about children leaving care, children growing up in adoption and becoming detached from families, etc. That in kinship care we just expect our children, the vast majority of us, to stay with us till they're ready to go, and we don't get any money or support or resources for that. We just do it, and I think that's fantastic, because it provides the children with exactly the sort of care that this review is looking for. But the problem is that we do it without any resources. It's quite nice to do that, but with some resources. So when they say they're going to prioritise and support us, I think good. So they want to evolve, and I think that means increase the number of children who stay in their families, and they want to support those who do stay in their families better than has been done. And certainly where I come from, better than has been done really means anything, so we couldn't have less resources in Sheffield. Jackie's heard me describe it as a black hole of kinship care support. So what was the role of Kinship, the organisation, in this? Well, they were involved from the start, as I said, in providing information about kinship care, providing research findings, links to kinship carers, and other support to ensure that the review board understood what kinship care was, what issues there were for us, what needed to change, and what struggles we were up against. So I think one of the, there was a blog written recently by the main civil servant, Shazia, who is involved with the excuse me, who's involved with the review, and she actually mentioned that Kinship had been immensely helpful in providing them with the resources they needed to understand kinship care and to be able to form a view about what they needed to do to help us. So Kinship's been very significant in that. But we still remain with the problem that many kinship carers have not recognised this review about them. And that's not surprising when we have kinship carers who don't even know that we're kinship carers. I know a friend from school who, when I first met her grandson, who she cares for, is in the same class as my grandson. And I said something about, it was nice to meet another kinship carer, and she said, "What's that?" She hadn't recognised her role at all in the terms of, the wider structure of children's social care. And like many of us, were struggling on with very little help. particularly around things like contact and helping with the child's identity, etc. I'm not going to discuss much of the case of change, but it is a really interesting document, and if you feel like reading it, it's on the Independent Review website. There is also an executive summary for those of you who don't want to read chapters and chapters. So that's like about 2 pages, which is quite helpful. Tells you what you need to know without wading through the lot. But it is very readable. It's not a difficult read. But there is a strong focus on poor outcomes for some children and the inequalities for some children and the absolute need to change this. And they do really well, because in the current, sort of, do I need to say this politely? In the current governmental situation, mentioning the P word, poverty, is a little bit dicey, but they bite the bullet and can firmly connect poverty with the chances of being in the care system. And we need to have that clearly stated, that poorer children are more likely to end up in care. And it's also that recognising that kinship carers themselves are poorer, they're more likely to have health problems, they're more likely to live in deprived areas. And yet we still do a good job. So going back to the focus, once again, one of the very strong focuses is on relationships. And I think they've picked that up very much. The idea of children having the relationships they need to actually grow and mature into young adults, and how the current care system often destroys relationships. Children are adopted and separated permanently from everybody in their families. Children are taken into care. They're often moved away from their neighbourhoods and communities. They may continue to have contact, but not always with every member of the family who meant something to them. The difficulties of keeping siblings in touch. Many siblings are still separated. And just also that children coming out of care, as I mentioned earlier, often have very few relationships. They struggle. They may not really have the resources to help them through young adulthood. As one of my other roles, I'm an independent visitor for a care leaver, and that's a role, a befriending role, set up to help care leavers have somebody in their life who acts as a friend, and that's to try and fill the gap of for children in care and care leavers who don't have enough relationships. So the case for change, it significantly concluded that kinship care should be prioritised and supported as a way of providing stability and permanence to children who cannot live with their families. So I think that we came out of the case for change extremely well. They argued that they need to focus action to promote kinship care as a positive option, and it could be the best option for many, and good outcomes, and the good outcomes compared to care in terms of education and mental health were part of the argument for this. So these were the things that the case for change said we needed to do. We need to identify kinship carers early on, rather than, I don't know how long any of you got to when you knew you were going to be kinship carers, but I know so many who've become kinship carers literally overnight. I mean, when I was an adopter, I had 6 months of training and discussion. I chose to be a doctor before I ever saw a child. I trained to be a doctor, I prepared to be a doctor, and then when that was all done, I then had another several months to choose, which child would fit with us, etc. When I became a kinship carer, I literally ran into work one day and said, I've got to leave, much to my boss's surprise. I've got to leave because I've got a 1-year-old, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's got that story. And I think, we often don't have chance to adjust to that role before we actually get it. So we need to be identified early on. And there is an argument that early support should include extended family much more thoroughly than it does at the moment, not only because kinship carers can be identified, but also because they can perhaps provide support to families to prevent them breaking down. So it could be involving external family in respite care, extra support, daycare, etc. So it's a more shared care arrangement. We also need to recognise that kinship carers tend to be older, they have health issues, and many of them have money problems, which are exacerbated by taking on extra children. So we need to be supported financially, practically, and therapeutically. Some kinship care children are eligible for money from the Adoption Support Fund for therapy, and others aren't. So that needs to apply to all of us. We need help with things like contact. We need to understand how to help children with their identity. We need peer support. We need training, and we need trauma-informed support so that we understand the impact of our children's past on their present. So, what is the review's ambition for us? To increase kinship care, to better support kinship care, and to not actually extend state involvement. They're not trying to make us into another set of foster carers. So briefly, because I'm going to stop in a minute and let you ask questions. Why do I believe in this? Well, there's two reasons really. And one is that as an adopter, I've campaigned for years for improved adoption support. And this was a bit like tilting at windmills, we campaigned and we campaigned and we campaigned and nothing happened. So we kept campaigning. And after 8 years of campaigning, something happened. And it shifted. And in Sheffield, we now have an extremely successful Sheffield Adopter Action Group who have successfully campaigned for change for adopters, and all sorts of very good things have been introduced because of that. But it took a long time to get going, and it's delightful to see that in action now. And when I realised that there was 200 people in our group, I decided to switch my energies over to Kinship, because I believed that campaigning can be successful, and I do still believe that. But I have to say, the other thing about me is my family do call me St. Jude, who is the patron saint of lost causes. So, but I think we have to try, because what's the alternative? Yeah. And I think the review has shown itself to listen to care experienced people. And although kinship carers have been the forgotten strand, the Cinderella service for many, many decades, this review has prioritised and supported us. And Kinship, the organisation, has the ear of the review and is very influential, and they're still listening to them in terms of the next phase of the review, which is to actually design a better children's social care system. So I feel that, having been close to it, obviously I was concerned about tokenism. Were we just there as window dressing? But I haven't felt it. What I felt is that we've genuinely been listened to. So I just want to say that Kinship have brought out many recommendations, and currently they're working on a detailed account of what we would like to happen as part of the call for ideas, isn't it, Rhiannon? And they're going to submit that to the call for ideas. And the 4 key things that they've said that they would like, and this is the key things, there's many other things, are financial support, because many of us are, we just raise our children on our pensions. And that means the national minimum fostering allowance, some practical support, priority around housing, therapy, peer support, contact support. And that came up a lot in the workshops, how much people needed help with their contact. Because for us, contact isn't about strangers like it is for adopters and care leavers. It's about our own kids, our own nephews, nieces, brothers, sisters. We're trying to organise contact with a family member. It's much more emotionally and practically tricky. Support for the children, making sure they get health assessments, access to CAMS, specialist education support, priority school choice. Oh, I hope they're successful with that one. Pupil Premium Plus, and to have the same access to services as looked after children and adopted children. And the final thing is a system that works for kinship carers, that's national and local strategy, that's coordinated, that we get on the map, that we're actually, people recognise as, I sometimes say I'm a kinship carer and people say, what's that? And then you have to explain yourself. That there's more data and more research about it. There's huge research gaps about kinship carers. There's such a lot of things they don't know about us. One of the biggest is, what children growing up in kinship care actually feel themselves. We're still working on getting that information. And of course, the legal issues, the mishmash of legal orders that leaves some of us with access to some services and some with none. So that's what Kinship are working on at the moment. And the call for ideas ends on December the 15th. But can I just say that this call for ideas is basically asking individuals, organisations, anybody to submit ideas about what they think children's a part of, or all of, if anybody's got that idea, kinship of children's social care should look like in the future. So it's actually making suggestions as to what we should have in a new model of children's social care. And that is open to everybody. And the link will be coming round from Kinship soon to everybody. And I can't really sort of emphasize too much the importance of people just saying what they think and getting in there and actually sort of giving the review their ideas and thoughts. Anyway, I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I'm running out of voice.
Okay. Thanks, Janet. I'll see if anyone's got any questions. So just to say hello, I work with Charlotte. So I'm Rhiannon. I'm one of the directors of campaigns and communications and external affairs. So it's lovely to see Kath and Charlotte. I don't know who's in the room with you. Sorry.
This is Jackie.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really helpful. Thanks, Janet.